Today I'm on my travels to Germany, to be precise, where I shall be staying for about a week, spending time with my wife's German family. That inevitably is going to affect the way I conduct videos, although it remains my intention to continue to broadcast videos throughout the time that I am in Germany. However, it's likely that these videos will be shorter than my usual videos. Some of you will no doubt find that a relief. And in any event, I'm going to have to make these videos at earlier hours of the day than I usually do in order to accommodate the time that I'm going to be spending with my German hosts. The result is that I may not be fully up to date on some of the events when the videos themselves are made. And it may happen from time to time that I discuss things and comment about various things without being aware of the fact that events have overtaken my comments and that some of the things that I'm saying are already out of date. Well, it is an occupational hazard. Whenever such a thing happens, of course, I will catch up and deal with the topic in my follow-up video. So all I can do is ask you to bear with me and to accept the fact that, as I said, over the period of this week, when I will be in Germany, I will obviously have to make videos in a somewhat different way to the way that I usually do. But in any event, I will try to the best of my ability to keep broadcasting throughout that period. Now, the first topic that I intend to discuss in today's video is the release in Britain of the journalist. I consider him to be a journalist. I consider him to be a great journalist. Julian Assange from Belmarsh prison. His travel by private jet to the island of Saipan in the Pacific, where he is due to appear before an American court, and in accordance with a plea bargain that has been negotiated on his behalf by his lawyers with the United States Justice Department, he will plead guilty to one specific offence under the Espionage Act. The United States will then accept that he has served the full sentence that he would be sentenced for this offence, were he to be tried for it in an American court and found guilty and sentenced. And on that basis, he will be released and he will become a free man, or at least a free man in a rather qualified way. Now, I'm going to say straight away that this is absolutely the correct decision by Julian Assange and his lawyers to agree to this plea bargain arrangement. I've discussed in many programs and in various formats and in programs that I have done for other channels and on other platforms, my strong feelings about this case, about the way in which the case has been conducted by the authorities in Britain, my deep disquiet about the way in which the case was conducted. And yes, it is true that Julian Assange a few weeks ago was granted leave to appeal by the High Court against the decision of District Judge Baritza in the Westminster Magistrates Court to greenlight his extradition to the United States. But this has come after years of protracted litigation in the British courts, throughout which time he has been held, in my opinion, completely wrongly, entirely inappropriately, in close confinement in Britain's high security Belmarsh prison. I think that in light of this terrible history, it would have been extremely reckless for Julian Assange and for his legal team to place too much reliance upon the High Court's decision to grant leave to appeal, and too much hope that in the event that the appeal were to proceed, the appeal would be allowed and the American extradition request would be refused. Based on what has happened before, we have seen at various times in the Assange case to be close to points where it looked as if the British courts were going to decide the case in Assange's favour, only for them to take an unexpected and, in my opinion, on occasion, frankly bizarre turns, which have thrown back Assange into this legal maze in which he has been trapped for years now. And of course, throughout the time when he has been in close confinement, he has been unable to live a normal life with his family. He's had only limited interaction with his wife and children. And by all accounts, his health, his physical condition has deteriorated, and at times he has appeared to be suffering from various levels of depression. I would add that the United Nations authorities have taken the view that some of the treatment that has been extended to Assange by the British authorities over the period of time when he has been held in Britain has amounted to what Americans would call cruel and unusual punishments. And, well, they come, in my opinion, close to torture. And one of the UN officials, whom I've actually spoken to and discussed this case with in person, he told me that that was also his opinion as well. And for the record, the person in question was Niels Meltzer. Just saying. So there we are. So I think Assange was entirely correct to follow the advice of his lawyers and the urgent pleas of his wife, and to agree to this plea bargain and to leave Britain and to go to Saipan, where he will plead guilty to this one charge, and then when he will be released and will be able to return finally to his home country, Australia, which I believe is also the home country of his wife, where he will finally have some possibility of leading a normal life. So absolutely no criticism should be made of him. On the contrary, he deserves support and sympathy, given the terrible ordeal which he has been through and the grave effects on his health that this ordeal will probably continue to have for, well, some time at least. I would add that the British authorities, who have behaved, in my opinion, in an appalling way throughout this case, well, they couldn't restrain themselves even in this last act. They apparently insisted that he must travel from prison to Stansted Airport to board this private plane in an armed convoy surrounded by dozens of police, with a police helicopter flying overhead. Quite what the purpose of all this was, of this extraordinary show of force, was, I'm completely unable to understand. What did they think exactly that Assange intended to do? As the head of WikiLeaks has correctly pointed out, it seems that the British were afraid that Julian Assange would in some way try to escape, even as he was driving towards ultimate freedom. as I said, it makes no logical sense, but it looks like some kind of demonstration of power by the British authorities, a rather intimidating behaviour on the part of the British authorities, and basically a message to Julian Assange that they do not want him to remain in Britain. Now, and that he should never, in fact, return to Britain. And that, by the way, is another good reason why Assange was right to accept this plea bargain. Because now that he has accepted this plea bargain, he can live in Australia, he can travel to other countries which would be prepared to grant him visas. Whereas, of course, if he had fought on and won the appeal, well, he would not have faced extradition to the United States, but he would have, in effect, been trapped in Britain, because had he travelled to any other country, there would have been a risk that the United States would come after him and would seek extradition, his extradition from that country. And as we have seen, even as Assange, in effect, remained trapped in Britain, the British authorities, as they have just shown, have every wish for him both to leave and to never return. And there is another really sordid twist to this story, because it seems that he was obliged to hire this private aircraft himself to fly to Saipan and from there to Australia. The Australian government has apparently covered the cost, but it has done so only by way of a loan which Julian Assange will have to repay. Julian Assange is not a wealthy man. He does not have the $500,000 that is needed to pay this loan. And again, he's going to have to be dependent on the support of his friends and supporters in order to avoid the bankruptcy proceedings he might face in Australia out of his need to pay for this airplane. Well, there we go. A horrible treatment of Assange, but the correct decision on his part to return to Australia and to accept the plea bargain. But of course, for everyone else, for everyone who works in the world of journalism, this is a very uncomfortable outcome to this case. It remains the case, in my opinion, that all that Assange has done is practice the trade of journalism. There have been repeated attacks on Assange over the course of these proceedings, and following the news of his release, I've seen a mounting crescendo of attacks on him from various people in the media who repeat all kinds of allegations which, to my knowledge, are not true, but which have been made time and again. For example, that he put US sources at risk when he didn't, and it's been accepted that he didn't. Anyway, allegations of that nature. And the fact that he has pleaded guilty, even if only to one offence, of course, will facilitate the claims that these people are making, that he actually did do something improper and wrong, which I don't believe that he did. Moreover, the reason that the United States has been in such pursuit of Assange, the reason, in my opinion, why the British authorities have been in such pursuit of Assange is because they do not want others to follow where he went, where he led, and to make the kind of disclosures about the kind of practices that the American and British governments undertook. And, well, perhaps they haven't got the strong judgment against Assange, declaring his actions illegal, finding him guilty under the Espionage Act. A plea bargain cannot be cited as a precedent in court. But nonetheless, the fact that Assange, after this terrible ordeal that he has to live through, has been brought to the point of having to plead guilty to a charge which he has repeatedly made clear he considers himself to be wholly innocent of. Well, I find that chilling, and I can't help but think that it is also going to have a chilling effect on the practice of journalism, journalism, investigative journalism, especially of the sort that he practiced. Anyway, that is all I'm going to say about the Assange case in this programme. I'm hoping to appear on a programme with Consortium News, which is going to appear on Saturday, where no doubt we will be discussing the Assange case in more detail. We will probably, with Consortium News's permission, republish the video of this discussion, which will include lawyers from various countries on the Duran, and we will no doubt discuss this case and this recent decision in greater detail. But anyway, for the record, I'm very happy that Assange has been released. He took the correct decision not to place his faith on the outcome of the appeal in Britain. But nonetheless, this whole affair leaves a very unsatisfactory taste. It gives us a deeply troubling outcome, one which I'm afraid investigative journalists around the world are going to take note of, and which inevitably is going to affect what they do. So let me proceed with the remainder of my programme. Now, to say briefly, the war in Ukraine, as I have discussed in several programmes recently, since the start of the year, has taken a terrible turn in terms of lives lost and damage done. And if you follow the line taken by the Russian Ministry of Defense, if you accept their claims for Ukrainian casualties as true or approximately true, then yesterday, 25th June, was perhaps the bloodiest day so far in the entire conflict in Ukraine. According to the Russians, according to the Russian Defense Ministry, the Ukrainian army across the contact line suffered yesterday losses of 2,345 men. I believe that is a record in the war. I think even in the worst period of Ukraine's summer 2023 offensive, even at the height of the fighting in Bakhmut and before that in Severodonetsk and Lysychansk, we have not had casualties at that level. This is a terrible toll. Now, as I've discussed in many programs, I believe that these figures, these approximate figures that the Russians are giving us for dead and wounded, are roughly true. And I have to say that over the last 2 days, the Ukrainians have made a claim which reinforces me in that belief. Ukraine is now claiming that as a result of the mobilization process, it is recruiting around 5,000 men a day. Now, that may be correct. I have no way of either proving or disproving it, but I have to say that I strongly suspect that this figure of 5,000 has been given because it is exactly double the amount of casualties the Russian Defense Ministry says that the Ukrainian army is suffering on any particular day. I think that, as is so often the case, the Ukrainians want to reassure their Western supporters and perhaps their own soldiers that despite the demographic realities, they are keeping pace with the scale of their losses. They are not only replacing their losses, but they're adding to their forces despite the losses being as high as they actually are. Well, that's what I think. Now, I would add that some weeks ago, no less a person than General Syrski cast doubt on the numbers that General Zaluzhny, apparently his predecessor, said that he wanted to mobilize. General Zaluzhny talked about mobilizing 500,000 men. General Syrski said that 150,000 was a more realistic figure, and that is another reason why I'm somewhat skeptical of this number that the Ukrainians are now citing. I regard it more as corroboration, further corroboration of the level of Ukrainian losses than a real indicator of the manpower situation within the Ukrainian army. Nonetheless, it is indisputably the case that Ukraine is undergoing a major mobilization process and that more men are being sent to the army. The Russians have confirmed as much. Yesterday, in my program yesterday, I spoke about comments made at the Primakov Forum by one of Putin's key foreign policy aides, Yuri Ushakov. Over the course of those comments, Ushakov also commented about the state of the special military operation and about the state of the Ukrainian armed forces. And TASS quotes him as saying, "True potential has not yet been exhausted in Ukraine, so the West intends to continue fighting. The West does not hear us and intends to fight together with Ukraine to the last Ukrainian." Now that suggests that the Russians are aware that Ukraine is mobilizing more troops, more men, that more men are joining the fighting. And as Ushakov says, the mobilization pool within Ukraine, therefore, has not so far been completely exhausted. And that explains why the war has to continue, at least for the time being. But, of course, that doesn't change the fact that this is a demographic catastrophe that the Ukrainian leadership and its Western allies, if that is the right word, are inflicting on the Ukrainian people. And it doesn't also change a further fact that because Ukrainian losses are so high, in order to keep up the numbers, Ukraine is having to send troops to the battlefronts without anything remotely approaching adequate levels of training. I've seen and heard reports that some Ukrainian soldiers are now being sent to the front after just a few days training. I think that is probably exceptional and unusual instances, probably caused by administrative chaos and disorganization, which seems to be fairly prevalent in Ukraine at the moment. But I understand that the actual length of time Ukrainian soldiers now get in terms of training is somewhere in the region of 8 weeks. Now, that is certainly insufficient to take on a military like the Russian, where I understand that soldiers are only sent into battle after a minimum of a year's training, and where obviously they operate within a military system where the army is far better equipped and far better armed than the Ukrainians are. Anyway, that's the grim reality of this war. You may read reports about how the situation in some parts of the front lines has supposedly stabilized. This is not, by the way, true, even if you understand the war in exclusively territorial gains, how much territory one side or the other has captured. It's not even true in those terms. But it is certainly not true in terms of the intensity of the fighting and the intensity of the attrition that the Ukrainians are experiencing. In that respect, it is absolutely the case that Ukraine is being bled to death. And of course, all of this, even as there are continuing weapons supply problems, even as Ukraine's energy system is now in effective collapse, even as Ukrainian officials talk about a winter of blackouts and of no electric power, or at least very limited levels of electric power, especially for ordinary consumers, of situation where half the population, according to an article in The Guardian, is believed to suffer from PTSD. What is happening in Ukraine is a horror story beyond any description. Now, there has been reports today over the last 24 hours that some of Donald Trump's advisors, including two in particular, of whom the most senior appears to be General Kellogg, have presented Donald Trump with a supposed plan for how to end the war in Ukraine, which he can implement as soon as he becomes president, and which supposedly will achieve peace in Ukraine. Now, the plan apparently is as follows: that the Ukrainians are told that they must immediately sit down and agree to negotiations with the Russians. If they refuse negotiations, then the United States will cut off the supply of arms to Ukraine. The Russians will be told that they must sit down immediately and begin negotiations with the Ukrainians. If they refuse, then the United States will increase supply of arms to Ukraine. Even as these negotiations supposedly take place, there is to be a ceasefire, which is to be maintained along the existing line of control, the existing conflict line. And in order to facilitate the process of these negotiations, the United States is apparently going to tell the Russians that the idea of Ukraine joining NATO will be deferred for the time being. Now, I get to say straightforwardly, if this is the plan, then I cannot see, based on what both the Russians and the Ukrainians are saying, I cannot see how it can work. The Russians have already made it clear that they will never accept any sort of proposal for a freeze of the conflict, which, to be quite clear, is what this plan essentially is. The Russians and the Ukrainians agree to negotiate, and there is a freeze along the conflict lines, the battle lines. That is a freeze. The Ukrainians will then do what they have always done, spin out the negotiations indefinitely, since they are complying with American demands or the new administration's demands. There would be no need for them, there would be no cause for them to stop receiving military supplies from the United States. Ukraine would be given the pause that it has sought and wanted. It would rearm, and at some point the war would start. The Russians would not even be granted the security of knowing that the whole idea of Ukraine entering NATO has been completely shelved. So I cannot see any possibility of the Russians agreeing to a proposal of this sort. As for the Ukrainians, well, they have ruled out negotiations with the Russians. They have insisted on complete fulfillment of their maximalist demands. And again, I see no sign that they're prepared to back off from that, though maybe, given how favourable this proposal ultimately is to them, they will actually go for it, if only to buy themselves time and to re-equip so that they can go back to war later. If President Trump really, if he assuming he is re-elected, thinks that this plan can work, if he really believes that this is the deal that's going to end the war, then I'm afraid he is wrong. And I would repeat to him the same advice I once gave to President Biden in one of these programs, a program I made way back in 2021, in fact, shortly after President Biden became president. I said in that program that what he needed to do was to change his foreign policy team, that his advisors, his foreign policy advisors, his foreign policy chiefs, Sullivan and Blinken, were not up to the job. And it seems to me that if this is the best that they can come up with, Kellogg and the other man, whose name I forget, Fights or something like that, doesn't seem as if they're up to the job either. Now, the Russians have rushed off rejections of this plan. The plan has been rejected outright by Sergei Lavrov. He didn't actually allude to it, but he said that if negotiations did start between Ukraine and Russia, presumably in some form of conformity with this plan, then the Russians would not agree to a ceasefire. They would be prepared to sit down and negotiate, but not on condition of a ceasefire. They've been through that before. They've already clearly rejected the idea of a freeze, and they would not accept a freeze on this occasion. Negotiations, yes, by all means, but certainly no freeze of the conflict. It would be like the Paris talks that took place between the United States and North Vietnam in the late 1960s and early 1970s, which continued even as the fighting in Vietnam went on. That's what Lavrov has said over the last couple of hours. And Peskov, Putin's spokesman, for his part, has come along and said that this plan can only work if it takes into account the territorial realities, which is Peskov's way of saying that the plan, the precondition for the plan is that Ukraine complies with the demands made by President Putin as set out in the speech that he gave to the Russian Foreign Ministry Board about a week ago, and that requires the complete withdrawal of all Ukrainian troops from the four regions, Zaporozhye, Kherson, Donetsk and Lugansk, before a ceasefire can take effect. So, I think that is going to remain the Russian position. For the record, I don't think that the Ukrainians would agree to negotiations where there was no ceasefire or no freeze. I don't see why that there would be what the incentive for them to do that would be. I predict as night follows day that when it became clear that this proposal was unacceptable to the Russians as well as to the Ukrainians, that the United States will blame the Russians and will support the Ukrainians, and that the intention actually of Mr. Kellogg and the others is in fact to continue to support Ukraine. I'm sure that is what the Russians themselves think. So there it is. I think this is where we are. Now, the only benefit of President Trump's plan, or of this plan, is if it actually does indicate that the United States is interested in beginning a serious negotiation process. And, well, that might be the case. It might be that negotiations between the United States and the Russians might happen. They might happen even if the current administration is re-elected in November. The Russian and US defense secretaries, Lloyd Austin and Andrei Belousov, had a telephone call just a few hours ago in which they both agreed to maintain contact and stressed the importance of preserving communication lines. Well, it might be that even the current administration, under the pressure of events, might agree to some sort of negotiation. But to be honest, if a negotiation is going to take place, I suspect that initially at least it would have to be between the Americans and the Russians, not between the Russians and the Americans, just as the Paris talks that in the 1970s were between the Americans and the North Vietnamese and did not directly involve the South Vietnamese. And the Russians, of course, have made it absolutely clear what they are seeking. I discussed this again in my program yesterday. They are seeking a renegotiation of the entire security system in Eurasia. Whether the incoming administration, whichever it is prepared to go along with that, well, that is an entirely different matter. Well, there we go. That's a plan. That's a proposal. It's just the same proposal that we've heard before, the proposal for a freeze of the conflict. The Russians have already rejected it. I'm not sure to what extent people in the United States understand this. And it seems that some people in the United States simply will not take no for an answer and still imagine that they can coerce and frighten and scare the Russians into concessions which the Russians show no willingness that they're prepared to make. So that's the first thing to say about this. Now, what is the situation on the battlefronts? Because, of course, that is what continues to drive this whole negotiation. I've just said how severe Ukraine's losses have been over the last 24 hours, but does that mean that Ukraine, nonetheless, despite all of these losses, is holding its positions, that they're withstanding the Russian advances, that the Russian offensives, or rather aggressive attrition if you prefer, the Russian offensive operations that began in October have indeed run out of steam or have hit some kind of stalemate? Well, the very fact of the escalation of Ukrainian losses, I would argue, points otherwise. But the big story, again, over the last 24 hours is of the steady increase in bombing, Russian bombing, with FAB-3000 bombs. The Russians have been increasing the number of bombs they drop, and they're now widening the range, the area in which they drop these massive bombs. Now, over the previous couple of days, all FAB-3000s were dropped, as far as I can see, over the village of Lipsy, a relatively small place in Kharkiv, but important because it lies halfway between the border and the city of Kharkiv. And Ukraine appeared to be making various attempts to mount attacks in the Lipsy area. For the moment, at least as of the time of making of this program, those attacks seem to have stopped. It could be that the effect of this rain of Russian bombs, not just FAB-3000s, but other bombs as well, is now meting out so much damage to the Ukrainian military forces on the ground that they've basically had to shelve ideas of counterattacks in the Lipsy area. But over the last 24 hours, we've also started to receive news that the Russians have begun bombing with FAB-3000s Ukrainian positions in and around Volchansk. Now, so far, it's apparently been airstrikes on Ukrainian positions outside Volchansk, the places where the Ukrainians are trying to concentrate their forces. The Russians have all of the main supply roads to Volchansk under fire control. They can shell and bomb and attack with drones any Ukrainian vehicles that move along these roads. And they can also now bomb Ukrainian concentration areas near Volchansk with these massive bombs. And they appear to be doing it. It is only a question of time before the Russians also start to drop these massive bombs on Ukrainian defensive positions in Volchansk itself. Now, Group of Forces North has been telling us rather less over the last 2 days about the situation in Volchansk. They claim, however, that they're still advancing. Their latest claim said that they'd advanced by a further 150 meters. And it could be that this is indeed the case. They're not telling us much any longer about the situation in the aggregate plant. And I think the most likely explanation of that is that they're probably now largely in control of the aggregate plant. There's also reports that film showing Russian troops in the area of the high-rise buildings. And in fact, about 2 days ago, the Group of Forces North actually said that they'd made small progress inside the area of the high-rise buildings. So the fighting in Volchansk is intense. It is likely that we're going to have heavy bombing of Ukrainian defense positions inside Volchansk. And all I will say is, I feel I cannot describe my feelings for the Ukrainian soldiers who are going to find themselves coming under the weight of these colossal 3-ton bombs. Some of you, no doubt, have seen films of what these bombs do, the gigantic explosions that come when they strike the ground, the utter destruction that they carry out on the neighboring buildings. If the Russians start dropping bombs of this sort on the high-rise buildings in quantity over the next few weeks, then, as I said, I cannot imagine what the effect will be on the Ukrainian soldiers who lie beneath them. Anyway, that's the situation in Volchansk. It seems to me that the fighting there is intense. As I say, Group of Forces North has been less informative over the last couple of hours. There doesn't seem to have been any major shift in the ground in Volchansk, despite the claim from Group of Forces North that they've advanced a further 150 meters. But it's likely that the big battle for Volchansk will start fairly soon, and it's likely that the Russians will before long bring their FAB-3000s to bear in that area as well. Now, elsewhere, the Russians continue to advance in the other traditional parts of the contact line. There are reports this morning that the village of Rozdolovka in the Seversk area has now passed entirely under Russian control. It's certainly the case that there are photographs of Russian soldiers carrying flags in Rozdolovka, Russian flags. Of course, that doesn't necessarily prove that the whole of Rozdolovka is under Russian control, but apparently this is a relatively small village. It's strategically important as forming part of the built-up area of, if you like, Greater Seversk. But given that it's a rather small village, it's plausible that the Russians have indeed captured it. The Russians are said also to be in the process of attacking another village in this area called Spornaya, a village, by the way, which, from recollection, the Russians actually captured back in 2022 and held for several months, though they withdrew from Spornaya at the culminating point of Ukraine's 2022 autumn Kharkiv offensive. But it seems that the Russians have decided that the moment has come to recapture Spornaya as well. And one way or the other, if you look at a map, you can see that the net around Seversk is closing. There are also a multitude of reports that the Russians have made further progress in the micro-district in Chasov Yar, west of the canal, west of the aqueduct, east of the aqueduct. Fighting in Chasov Yar again is said to be intense, and there are reports that once more, because of the disastrous manpower shortages, the Ukrainians have had to redeploy troops from Chasov Yar to Toretsk, where the Russians achieved a breakthrough over the last 2 days to try to hold back the Russian advance. And this, of course, opens the way for the Russians to achieve further advances in the Chasov Yar area. Now, alongside all of this, we've had news, we continue to have news from the Ocheretino-Avdiivka area. Fighting continues apparently in the village of Sokol. The Russians have, even according to the Ukrainians, now obtained full control of the village of Novo-Alexandrovka, and they're advancing towards this key highway between Pokrovsk and Konstantinovka, Chasov Yar. So the fighting there continues to be intense, but this, for once, does not seem to be the area where the fighting was most intense over the last 24 hours. And I'm going to go back again to the report of the Russian Defense Ministry. The Russian Defense Ministry says that in the Kharkiv area, Group of Forces North inflicted 235 losses of men and wounded upon the Ukrainian army. It says that the Group of Forces West, who are conducting most of the operations in the Kupiansk and I believe Siversk area, that the losses that they inflicted on the Ukrainians numbered 445. They then claim that in the area of Kurakhovo and the village of Konstantinovka, and I suspect Krasnogorovka as well, the Group of Forces South inflicted on the Ukrainians an absolutely shocking casualty loss of 830 men. 830 in one sector of the battlefronts. Now, I can remember times not so long ago in this conflict when Ukrainian losses, according to the Russian Defense Ministry, across the entire battlefronts would be numbered at less than this, significantly less than this figure of 830 in one relatively confined area. And, well, what exactly is going on? Well, there's been a lot of reports that the Russians are now completing the battle for Krasnogorovka. Now, I've heard this many times, but there's been a cascade of reports over the last couple of days which appear to show Russian forces advancing through the remaining areas of Krasnogorovka that have continued to be under Ukrainian control. In fact, there are even reports that the Ukrainians are withdrawing from Krasnogorovka completely. Though I should stress, I've heard those reports before. Perhaps they are unreliable this time, as they have been on other occasions. But it is a certainty that some of these 830 men that Group of Forces South is supposed to have killed or wounded over the course of the last 24 hours, well, they seem to have, they probably were lost in Krasnogorovka. But this is what the Russian Defense Ministry says. this is how it describes the fighting in this area. Units of Group of Forces South improved the tactical situation along the front lines and inflicted losses on manpower and hardware of the 72nd Mechanized Brigade. That is the Ukrainian military unit that previously defended Novomikhailovka and Paraskovievka, and which is now trying to defend the village of Konstantinovka. Anyway, the 72nd Mechanized Brigade, the 46th and 81st Air Mobile Brigades near Konstantinovka and Kurakhovo. And in other words, the Russian Defense Ministry implies that it is in this area that the fighting has been most intense and where most of those 830 men were lost. Now, that points to extremely intense fighting happening close to Kurakhovo, probably in the village of Maximilianovka, which is immediately to the west of Georgievka, but also perhaps not in Konstantinovka itself, but in the areas immediately to the south of Konstantinovka, along the supply road that connects Konstantinovka with the town, the fortified town, the fortress town of Vuhledar further south. And there's been a long analysis of the fighting in this area, perhaps not coincidentally, by Rozdolovka, Russian newspaper based in Smolensk, strongly nationalist, supports the special military operation. Anyway, Rozdolovka says that this is where the Russians have achieved an important breakthrough. They imply that the village of Vladimirovka, close to this road, where the a group of Ukrainian troops was supposed to have been surrounded. Well, the Rozdolovka says, or seems to say, that this village has now passed under Russian control, and that the Russians are not just seeking to cut this road, but that they are also seeking to capture some industrial sites, another landfill, another slag heap, in other words, some other important buildings which provide cover and are part of the defensive network of Vuhledar. It sounds a little bit like a repeat of the Battle of Avdiivka all over again, that the Russians pressing around Vuhledar, all of these battles, the battles in Krasnogorovka, in this village of Konstantinovka, in Maximilianovka, they're all ultimately about cutting the supply lines and breaking through and ultimately capturing this fortress of Vuhledar, which the Russians have on previous occasions attempted and failed to capture, suffering sometimes severe losses in the process. So this is where the fighting for the moment appears to be most intense, according to the Russians. But let's take a step back, because again, we see the nature of the war that the Russians are fighting. They've not concentrated all their forces in one place. They're attacking towards Vuhledar in the south. They continue this enormous operation in the Ocheretino-Avdiivka area, which is clearly linked to their other operations in Toretsk, where, according to some reports, the Russians continue their advances, where the Ukrainians are rushing reinforcements from Chasiv Yar, in Chasiv Yar itself, and, of course, in Kharkiv, especially in Volchansk. the Russians are attacking all of these places at the same time, and they are causing the Ukrainians to expend men and machines trying to defend all of these places. There is no thought, apparently, on the Ukrainian side of pulling back to perhaps more defendable positions and to shortening their defence lines, which have now become incredibly overextended. Instead, the Ukrainians seem to have fallen back on the tactic of relying on fortress cities, Volchansk, Chasiv Yar, Toretsk, Krasnogorovka, Vuglidar, perhaps before long, Kurakhovo and Pokrovsk, to try to keep the Russians at bay. And this is perhaps another area where the FAB-3000s will come into play, because it looks like precisely the sort of bomb that you would need to use to break defences in these fortress cities that the Ukrainians seem to be intent on creating. Now, fortress cities might be all very well as a plan. Certainly they don't seem to me to suggest flexible defence, which some people are talking about. Brian Beletic has done a good video about this. But of course, the thing to understand about fortress cities is that they can become, and perhaps will become, a trap for the defenders. We have a situation in Volchansk where men of the 71st Jaeger Brigade are apparently trapped in the area of the high-rise buildings north of the aggregate plant. We have a situation in Chasiv Yar where some of the best units of the Ukrainian army are in effect trapped in the micro-district west of the aqueduct. And it's now seems to be becoming increasingly the view that if the Russians capture the micro-district, or rather when the Russians capture the micro-district, then that will be the loss for Ukraine of the main fortified position in Chasiv Yar, and the remainder of the town will fall. We saw in Avdiivka that large numbers of Ukrainian troops were trapped at the time when resistance in Avdiivka collapsed, and, well, perhaps 1,000 were taken prisoner. We see troops in Krasnogorovka, Ukrainian troops in Krasnogorovka, apparently afraid that they could find themselves encircled as well. And we see that the Russians are moving steadily and methodically towards conducting an encirclement operation of Vuglidar, and the terrible losses the Ukrainians are experiencing, according to the Russians, as they try to stem this encirclement process. Well, as I said, fortress cities might make a certain kind of sense. I suspect it was a strategy that was agreed by the Ukrainians and the Americans some time ago. But when all of these cities fall, as eventually they do, already several of them, Bakhmut, Avdiivka, Severodonetsk and Lysychansk, others have fallen, Marinka as well. When they fall, they carry an enormous cost to the defenders when they do. And then it isn't just the defense lines that get smashed, it's also the Ukrainian army, the Ukrainian soldiers who have been trying to defend these places. Well, anyway, I'm not going to dwell on this further, but that, it seems to me, is the Ukrainian tactic. The Russians, as I said, seem to be intent on creating some kind of cauldron situation in the Ocheretino-Toretsk, Avdiivka area. And in fact, by the way, they seem to be taking steps to advance now to the rear of the Ukrainian forces in Toretsk through an advance towards the Ukrainian village of Alexandropil, which is located to the west of Toretsk. So we can see that the Russians have some kind of tactical vision, whereas the Ukrainians, they just dig in, stand and fight. Occasionally they conduct counterattacks, but perhaps they rely too much on their defences, their fixed defences, and of course that makes them terribly vulnerable to the Russian guns and to the Russian bombs. Now, coming back to the Americans, what exactly is it that they plan to do to reverse this process? Now, there's a report circulating today that the United States government intends quietly to give formal sanction to private American military companies sending units, sending contractors to Ukraine. Contractors, of course, are mercenaries. There has been no shortage of mercenaries in Ukraine. They have never managed to change the situation. Adding American mercenaries to Polish mercenaries and mercenaries from other countries won't change the situation either. So that isn't going to work. I've discussed at length the extraordinary dangers the whole idea of launching missile strikes deep into Russia poses. The problems with the F-16s are now widely acknowledged. If the incoming administration, whichever it is, finally acknowledges the realities of the situation, they will not waste time with proposals about freezes. They will say to the Russians, look, we don't recognize any of your territorial gains, but we do want to bring the conflict to an end. We accept that Ukrainian troops should withdraw from the 4 regions, which they can't defend and can't reconquer. We acknowledge that there will be an armistice line, and we agree that Ukraine should not join NATO. There's lots of other things that could then be talked about, but that, it seems to me, is the best way forward for the United States. That is a much more realistic plan than the plan that General Kellogg and the others are said to be proposing to President Trump, which is simply a mechanism to keep the war going, to keep it continuing. Now, there is another reason why the United States, quite apart from the obvious humanitarian and geopolitical reasons, but there's another reason why the United States would, in my opinion, be very well advised to come to terms with the Russians and to seek to end the conflict in Ukraine as soon as possible. Now, I've discussed in many programs, as has Brian Beletic, even better, the extreme depletion of American arsenals, the difficulty the United States has in keeping Ukraine equipped for war, and the strong likelihood that the Russians, the gap in capability between the Russians and the Ukrainians, far from shrinking, is actually going to continue increasing. And the FAB-3000s are probably a reflection of this. Bear in mind that the Russians have intercepted the great majority of the ATACMS missiles that are launched against them, but the Ukrainians, of course, have not been able to shoot down a single FAB bomb. It's unlikely that they possess that capability. In fact, one can confidently say that they don't. So, there is this massive depletion of American arsenals. But demand on those arsenals is potentially going to increase further over the next few weeks. And this is another product of the failure of the diplomacy of the current administration. Diplomacy is perhaps too generous a word. The Israelis have, since October, been conducting a major military operation in Gaza. Now, I have always been opposed to this military operation. I was certain it was going to result in massive civilian casualties, which it has. I was also certain that it would fail to destroy Hamas, which has also proved to be the case. I felt that the Israeli army would exhaust itself. There was a real risk that the Israeli, or possibility, some would say prospect, that the Israelis would exhaust themselves in this battle in Gaza against a well dug in and well organized adversary. I said that street fighting was not something that any military should want to embrace, at least not the Israeli military, not over a territory in Gaza, like Gaza. And above all, I said that a conflict in Gaza for Israel, and indeed for the United States, would be politically disastrous. I was not the only person who said these things. Alistair Crooke said these things, and he said it as a former British diplomat who is familiar with Gaza and who is familiar with the dynamics of the region. Daniel Davis also said it. He is a military officer. He assessed the situation in Gaza. He has experience of war and of command in battle, and he came to that exactly same view. And so it has turned out. The Israelis have been conducting military operations in Gaza for, I believe it is 8 months now. Hamas is still there. There's been an article in Foreign Affairs which says that it is now, politically speaking, stronger than ever. Certainly, many of its fighters have been killed, perhaps, according to the Pentagon, 8,000 of them, which is a huge proportion of the force Hamas started the war with, which is said to number 30,000. But Hamas is a religious movement as well as a political one. Its fighters believe that if they're killed in battle, they will achieve martyrdom with all its rewards in the next life. It is not going to deter Hamas or its fighters that they suffer casualties on this kind of scale. They are not, in other words, the Ukrainian army, for whom losses are ultimately a deeply demoralizing experience. With Hamas, on the contrary, one suspects that in many cases, the fact of high losses actually exalts them. So, the battle in Gaza has played out with Hamas still there, with tens of thousands of civilians killed, huge numbers of buildings destroyed, including some ancient buildings which were historic monuments, and a massive turning against Israel across much of the world and amongst many people in the United States. And it seems that the Israeli army in Gaza is tired, that they've been fighting for months, that the soldiers are becoming weary of the war and doubtful that victory can be achieved, and they are apparently becoming increasingly critical. One of the important aspects to know about Israel is that it is, in some ways, a society that plays out its quarrels very much in the open. So it's not one of those places where one has to spend time trying to decipher tensions, because in Israel, they are there for all to see. When they happen, they're there for all to see. So we know, for example, that Netanyahu, the prime minister, now leading a government in its original format. The war cabinet has gone, the moderates have left, the hardliners are very much in control of the government, and Prime Minister Netanyahu must be considered one of them. Anyway, Prime Minister Netanyahu is said to be now angry and critical, and in fact is openly quarrelling with some of his senior military commanders who are saying that the war in Gaza has basically exhausted itself. But Prime Minister Netanyahu can't just switch off the war in Gaza. He's resisted every American attempt to get him to agree to a ceasefire, even a ceasefire that in some respects would be favourable to Israel itself. But he seems to be acknowledging, Prime Minister Netanyahu, that the operations in Gaza can't continue at the same level of intensity as they have already been doing. And at the same time, since he cannot claim victory in Gaza, he is refocusing to the north, to the challenge from Hezbollah, the militia movement, the Shia militia movement, backed by Iran, which is positioned in southern Lebanon. And all the indications now are that Israel is drifting towards an armed confrontation, an all-out war, if you like, with Hezbollah. And again, American diplomacy ineffectively, at least, gives the impression of wanting to prevent this war, though if that is indeed what they're trying to do, they're not being very effective in doing it. And of course, at the same time, they're making it clear that if such a war does take place, the United States will back Israel to the hilt, and that Hezbollah and its sponsor, Iran, know this. Now, if there is a war between Israel and Hezbollah, a war which might plausibly involve Iran, though the Iranians, I think, will be very circumspect about how they involve themselves in this conflict. But if there is such a war, then, of course, demands on American arsenals are going to grow. Now, there is the weapons requirements for a war between Israel and Hezbollah are not identical to the ones between the ones in the war between Ukraine and Russia. But there are going to be overlaps. Israel is going to need air defense systems. Air defense systems are something that Ukraine is dangerously short of. We see that the Russian Air Force is becoming increasingly effective and aggressive across the battle lines. It's also likely that the Israelis are going to need lots and lots of shells. We see that shells are in short supply. What, therefore, does the United States do? Does it keep supplies going to both Israel and Ukraine, equipping both of them to an inadequate level, increasing the prospect that each of them will lose? Or does it prioritize one over the other? And if so, which one should it prioritize? Well, in the case of a future Trump administration, I don't think there's any doubt at all, politically, putting aside any emotional feelings, a future Trump administration is going to prioritize support for Israel. President Trump's entire history up to this time strongly points to that. In which case, these threats from General Kellogg and others to go on equipping Ukraine are simply not going to be realizable. It's debatable whether they're realizable at all for the moment, but they are going to be even less realizable if a conflict between Israel and Hezbollah begins. Now, of course, it may be that this conflict between Israel and Hezbollah will never take place, that there will be some kind of negotiated solution. But I have to say that, again, if President Trump were properly advised, then he should be advised about the constraints on what the Americans currently can do. The fact that there are limits to how many weapons they can keep providing to their various allies and proxies. Ukraine has proved a massive burden. Israel, however, finds itself in a conflict, and it will be looking to the United States. Another country which has gone into a conflict with a country far more powerful than itself also seems to be turning to the United States looking for help. And that, by the way, is the Philippines, which under its current president, President Marcos Jr., has been drifting into a confrontation with China, its major economic partner. And if the Philippines gets into a confrontation, or if a confrontation is threatened, it too, along with Taiwan, is going to need American weapons. Now, I don't think that these are the major reasons why one should seek peace in Ukraine. There are overriding humanitarian considerations why peace in Ukraine is essential. The need to preserve Ukraine is essential. The avoidance of a geopolitical catastrophe in Europe makes peace in Ukraine essential. But there are limits to American power. If this affair in Ukraine has demonstrated anything, it is that. And the sooner the United States recognizes those limits, the better for the United States it will be. The United States cannot be strong everywhere. It is clear that that is beyond its power. It needs to start prioritizing. It may have to prioritize the Middle East over Ukraine before very long. It may have to sacrifice the Middle East if it finds itself in a conflict with China. To be clear again, my view is that the United States should be seeking peace in all of these conflicts. But if you want to persist in the kind of confrontational politics that the United States has been conducting, then you have to start thinking about priorities. And that is what I think General Kellogg should be explaining to President Trump. Forget about this idea of a freeze. Focus on getting peace in Ukraine. If peace is achieved in Ukraine, blame all the problems and everything that's gone wrong on the previous administration. Wouldn't be so difficult to do. And try and at least stabilize the situation in Europe and reduce the number of problems that are piling up all over the world and are threatening to get out of control. Well, will that happen? Probably not. So far, the ability to decide on priorities seems to be one that is beyond America's power. But anyway, we will see. We will see whether decision-making in a future administration might be a bit more coherent and a bit more realistic than it has been in with the present one. But in the meantime, the war in Ukraine goes on. The death toll there is rising. The devastation is growing. The situation within the Ukrainian command is looking increasingly unstable. As I've said many times, the door for negotiations will not remain indefinitely open. And while it is still open, for everyone's sake, it is important that America finally decides that the moment has come to walk through. Well, that's my programme for today. As I said, my next programme will be broadcast from Germany. This is where I wish you all well and say that, and remind you all that you can find all our programmes on our various platforms, Locals, Rumble and X. You can support our work via Patreon and Subscribestar. Don't forget to check out our shop, where you can find all sorts of amazing things, including our Football 24 series. I believe that's still ongoing. And last but not least, if you've liked this video, please remember to tick the like button and to check your subscription to this channel. That's me for today. More from me soon. Have a very good day.